It's really good to welcome all of you here for this conversation today. I am so pleased to have our four guests with us, four people that two of whom I've gotten to know recently, two of whom I've known for a long time. The Reverend Jacqui Lewis has been a friend and a colleague for a couple of decades now. It's been great to get to know, and for the last several years, Reverend Eli Valentin, I had the great pleasure of joining LaTosha Brown and Sheena Mead on a trip to Israel, Palestine recently, and to get to know them better and the amazing work that they are doing, both to ensure that people can participate in this small d democratic process, but also to have access to the ballot, how important that is. So this is going to be an exciting, rich conversation I think we'll have today. I want to thank all of you out there for joining. I want to thank Alexis Vaughn and the rest of the team at Interfaith America for all the ways in which they contributed to this, our founder and president, Ibu Patel, and so many others. So thank you for joining us. Thank my friends and colleagues again for being here today, for responding to the invitation. And I think we should just get started. And to kick us off, we've asked the Reverend Dr. Jacqui Lewis if she will first tell us a little bit about herself and then talk to us about why voting is a sacred act. Dr. Lewis.
Thank you, Reverend. Hey, everybody. How are you today? God bless you. I'm so glad to be in this conversation with these esteemed, amazing colleagues. And I'm really grateful for a chance to do some theological framing. I'm Jacqui Lewis. I'm the senior minister at Middle Collegiate Church in Manhattan. It is a multi-everything, strange and wonderful congregation of about 2,000 people. We are where Broadway meets spiritual revival, meets gospel throwdown, meets therapy, is the way we think about ourselves. And one of the things that we really believe is an important part of our faith life is our civic life, is our politic life. We really believe that we are following in the way of Jesus, who we call Christ, who his colleagues would have called Rebbe Yeshua, ben Yosef, Joseph's son, Mary's boy, a rabbi, not trying to start a new religion, really, but trying to reform his own religion, a religion that we inherit in some ways. But this idea of tikkun olam would have been central to Jesus's faith as a rabbi, as a Jewish person called to heal the world in the context of empire, right? In the context of what was the so-called Roman peace, and which was not peace at all. It was like cohabitating, if you will. It was occupation, if you will. The Palestinian people occupied by Rome, roads, yes, swords, yes, an army, yes, some food, yes, but high taxation, yes, you were free to worship your God, but you weren't free. And in that context, I'm going to say, I, like Jesus, like to shake it up and have temple tantrums every now and then and shout and scream about when injustice is being done in the name of God. That's not how we're trying to roll. To tell you that more about me, I'm a grandmother of two. I'm a wife. I'm a daughter to Emma and Richard. And I am called by God to do a bold new thing on the earth, which is to use my voice and my vote to heal the world. I was asked to talk about why is vote sacred, and I'm going to maybe do three things. I'm going to go back to Rabbi Jesus for a second to say that his ministry was one of preaching, teaching, and healing. And so what was he preaching? What was he teaching? What was his charisma? What was his message? His message was, you are amazingly built in the image of God, and you deserve dignity, and you deserve wholeness, and you deserve wellness. So in his preaching through the region of Galilee, all the way to Jerusalem, he was doing battle with his voice against the powers and principalities, right? He was speaking truth to power. You have heard it say, but I said. You've heard it said, but I say. Reframing what a social order should be. He inherited a social order of Caesar, senators, rich folk, poor folk, slaves. And in every way that he could, he was saying, let's reverse that. Let's invert that. The first will be last, the last will be first. The one who's left outside needs to be pulled inside. He did that with his voice, with parables. I say he did that with his voice because he wasn't a citizen and he couldn't vote. But he did it with his voice. And my kind of second point is to say that he used some of the structure or the language of empire to do the inversion. Let me be particular. The Lord's Prayer is a revolutionary prayer in which Jesus says, our Father, my Father, our God is God. Not Caesar, but my Father is God. My Father is in charge of this world. Your kingdom come, not the empire come, but God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, not standing in bread lines, but let us have what we need today, enough for tomorrow. That was a revolutionary prayer. When Jesus preaches the Beatitudes, which most of us who are Christians memorized as kids, I don't think we understood the revolutionary nature of the Beatitudes. Blessed are, happy are the poor in spirit, for they shall see the kingdom of God. Happy are, blessed are those who mourn. The word there in the Greek for blessed or happy is a word, y'all, only applied to citizens of the empire. Can you feel me? Only citizens were called happy or blessed. And Jesus is saying, when you're outside, you're blessed. When you're mourning, you're blessed. When you don't belong, you're blessed. When you're mourning, you're blessed. When you suffer for my behalf, you're blessed. The empire's category of citizen, Jesus puts for all of the people in the empire. So he's blessing them with citizenship and the ability to make a difference in the world just by the nature of them being God's people. I'm a geek about exegesis, so that really floats my boat to think that word itself and that prayer, those two things are sort of like empire-shifting, world-altering, transformative words from one who couldn't vote, but who wanted us to know that our voice matters. And I think the third thing I'd say really quickly about the sort of sacredness of vote and voice is to think about the creation story, which is, of course, a myth. You know, it is a story, but it's a story to teach us something about God. And in that myth, in that story, when God scoops up the clay and animates it with breath and decides to make a ha-adam, a person, and a partner, God says, this is very good. But God says it, God speaks. The Hebrew word there is dabar. God says there'll be light. God says there'll be darkness. There'll be a firmament between the heaven and the earth. There'll be oceans and creatures. There will be. God spoke the creation into existence and then made us in her image, which is to say that we also have the ability to speak the world we want into existence. How do we speak it into existence? I love when I get LaTosha to give me an oomph. I feel really good about that. That's almost an amen.
That's right. It is amen.
I like it. But when we who are created in the image of the holy have the same, fearsomely and awesomely made substance, is what the psalmist says in Psalm 139. That means we speak like God speaks, and we call each other in, and we call the world in, and we shape the world with our voice. What's the world we want? How do we want it to look? Safe places for children to play, enough food on the table for everybody, seniors not having to pick medicine or food, right? Trans kids not having to struggle in their bodies, gay folks being able to be loved and love who they love. Black lives matter, Black votes matter, immigrants matter. All of those things that we speak into existence, we do it in the image of God, called in by God, and voice becomes vote, because we are citizens of this United States, not just of these United States, but we are citizens, come on somebody, of the reign of God, and we are called by God to build a healed and whole world with our voice and our vote. I will close. My mama died 5 years ago. She's in the middle. She sang in the choir with Fannie Lou Hamer in Louisville, Mississippi. Her uncle, my great uncle, rocked me to sleep on the little porch in front of my grandmother's house, but only after he walked up and down dusty roads in Louisville, Mississippi, registering people to vote with Miss Fannie Lou Hamer. He's a trustee at the church where she's called in by SNCC to do the work. Uncle George recruited me. I'm recruiting y'all. Do not be apathetic. Use your voice, use your vote. Let's build the reign of God on earth. Amen. It's sacred.
Amen.
Amen.
I made Sheena smile. I made LaTosha oomph. Y'all, I feel so happy.
I know we all have to be polite on Zoom, but I am sure that there are many amens being said out there. Really appreciate that framing and just the reminder that we are all valid and have voice, whether or not we are inside or outside of these structures and systems that our society creates. And now I want to transition to you, LaTosha, and your work. We know that you created the Black Voters Matters Fund. And if you could tell us a little bit about what inspired that work for you, and what types of barriers to voting and civic engagement you're hoping that that work addresses.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me, over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. You know, I wanted to start, I thought I was going to sing another song, but that is the song that came to my spirit, because I do believe that captures even the spirit of why we started Black Voters Matter. We just want our people to be free. We just want to feel Black liberation in a way that we actually are safe and secure, that our humanity is recognized, that we have the same protection of rights as everybody else, that we're able to operate unencumbered of oppression, racism, sexism, homophobia, and all of those things. And so, you know, the impetus of my work didn't start with me. It started centuries before I was probably even a thought, but that I am a continuation. What we wanted to do is to continue the work and continue the work that even in the spirit of that song of some folks who said that there was no other option for them but freedom. And so we created this organization in 2016 that part of the work that we thought we would do is actually build an ecosystem. We would create an organization that would support organizers, that those that were on the front lines of doing freedom building work, that would have the resources they need to actually be able to build their infrastructure and build the capacity of that work. And so we created Black Voters Matter kind of with 3 buckets in mind. One, that we would put more money on the ground, that we at many times that as we were organizing, we just simply didn't have the resources we needed. Sometimes we didn't have gas money to figure out how we could organize from one community to another community. And so we wanted to use it. Cliff Albright and I, who is the other co-founder, wanted to use our skills as fundraisers and working in philanthropy to be able to get resources and put them on the ground. And over the last 5 years, we've been able to organize $27 million in resources and get those resources deployed directly to Black-led grassroots groups on the ground. The second thing we wanted to do is literally be able to build a movement, right? To build a movement that was centered in 2 principles: the power of love and power. And that at the intersection of our faith and the intersection of our work is always centered in this balance between literally standing in the fullness of our power and also grounding that in love. And so we wanted to build a movement that had those 2 bookmarks around power and love. And so over the years, we've actually used that. We always talk about we're building power and spreading love at the same time. And you can do that. You can actually stand and operate in the space of power with the principles and being guided and in alignment with love and a love strategy. And then the third thing we want to do is shift the message. We want to shift this narrative of who Black Southerners were. We want to shift the narrative that because we're living in these states, that oftentimes, you know, what we see in the national media, red states, you know, that our states aren't red or blue, our states are filled with people. And that fundamentally our work is to really be able to recognize the agency of those that are on the ground that are pushing for social change. And so that would be the third part of our work. And so we created Black Voters Matter with those 3 things in mind, that it'd be movement, money, mobilization, that fundamentally that's what we would do around the message. And so over the course of our work, what we do is, we build out the ecosystem. Our goal was to build out the ecosystem of organizations that are already doing the work, not just organizations that are doing civic engagement work. Some groups that we work with are doing felony reenfranchisement work, formerly incarcerated people. Some of the groups that we work with are actually doing work around abolition work. Some groups are doing economic justice work. Some are doing environmental justice work, but that we would actually build out, or at least help build the capacity of the ecosystem of groups that were doing the work, and we would do it in a space that affirmed our humanity, that affirmed our agency and our ability to be able to shape public policy. So that is the work that we do at Black Voters Matter.
Wonderful, that's incredible. I think one of the things that you mentioned just in the work is just like, we're not free, right? There are so many barriers to folks participating in our democracy. We're grateful for our democracy, but we know it is not perfect. So Sheena, I'd like to transition to you to share a little bit about the Clean Slate initiative. And for folk who may not know what the experience of folks who have been incarcerated, who are now transitioning back into community, what that's like and what some of the challenges they face are like.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to be on this esteemed panel with some of my sheroes and heroes. And I appreciate you being here today. So my name is Sheena Meade. I'm the executive director of the Clean Slate Initiative. We are a bipartisan national organization that focuses on record clearing and sealing for people who have, what folks like to say, paid their debt to society, who've done their time, been crime-free, and is looking for a second chance. And just to kind of give you an understanding of how many people are impacted. In America, there are 70 to 100 million people who have some sort of criminal record, legal record, up to 100 million. I believe there's only like 300 million people that live in America.
That's right.
So 1 out of 3 Americans have some type of record. 1 out of 2 children have a parent with a record. And so this is not something far-reaching. When you count across the panels on this call, 1, 2, 3, I'm that third person. I'm somebody who's impacted. And that number is real. I go into plenty of spaces and I actually ask folks and I say, there's 1 in 3. And I just want to see if the statistic is right. And most likely it's right. There's so many barriers. I would be remiss if I did not add, before I came to Clean Slate, what brought me to Clean Slate was the work that I did at Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, working alongside of my husband, Mead, and thousands of advocates across the state to pass Amendment 4 that restored voting rights to 1.4 million people who had felony convictions. At that time, you were banned for life. It was in our Constitution that you could not vote if you had a felony conviction. And we know this came out of the Jim Crow laws where, folks were getting felony convictions for just standing on corners or, for even fishing or driving on suspended license, and they would lose their voice for life. And so we was able to change that in 2019 through partnerships. And now, that I'm at the Clean Slate Initiative, where we don't really focus just on voting rights, but we focus on all those other barriers that are before people who are trying to return to their communities, and some who have never been incarcerated. There are people out there that have been arrested, that have convictions, and arrests that did not lead to convictions that still face barriers. And across America, there's about 45,000 collateral consequences that are faced, that are in front of folks who have some type of record. And when I say collateral consequences, I'm talking about barriers, meaning access to jobs, access to housing, access to employment, access to the voting box, even the simplest things that we may take for granted. I was out in Oklahoma, and there was a young lady who was formerly incarcerated who started a program for young women coming home to get into cosmetology. In Oklahoma, in the prison, she learned how to do cosmetology inside the prison. That was her trade that she had to do. That was her job she had to do according to the prison. And she realized that she learned a new skill. She could bring the skill back home because she knew that she would be barred from many job opportunities because of her record. When she came home, she realized that in Oklahoma, you need an occupational license to wash hair. And you're banned as someone who's formerly incarcerated to just walk into a salon and say, I would like to wash hair. You have to get a license. And so those are the issues that we're hearing across the country, where people are just banned from the simplest things. Going to a field trip like myself with my child, when I want to take my child to SeaWorld. And I had to go through this cumbersome application. I had to relive, this conviction that I got dismissed off my record, but I had to file the paperwork. And I ended up saying, it's too much. Don't worry about it. And I'm an active parent, but imagine how many other parents who had to, did not want to stigmatize their child or go through that process or not engaging in their children's education. And so these are issues that we're addressing, but the main thing that we're doing at the Clean Slate Initiative, we are focusing on removing that barrier for the 70 to 100 million folks by passing legislation, working with state partners on the ground, just as LaTosha's working with state partners, moving resources, moving technical assistance, changing narrative, and moving all those resources to state partners to pass legislation to clear records. And since I've been at the helm, since 2020, we've passed Clean Slate in 7 states. And we're working at up to 16 states right now. I know in Pennsylvania alone, they have cleared over 60 million records, over 1.5 million people now have a second chance at life, to employment, to housing, to new opportunities. And so we're focused on creating those new opportunities and working with partners on the ground who is engaged in civic engagement. This is just not a policy shop campaign. We are being intentional, centering directly impacted people, policy people, grassroots organizations, because we know that this issue intersects with many other issues that's on the ground. And that's the way that we're doing our work. And we're working with the faith community, because we know that redemption, no matter what faith tradition that you are a part of, redemption, forgiveness, and restoration sits at the heart of it, at the foundation of it. And we want to lead with that message.
Thank you so much, Sheena. I would just want to say one of the things that inspires me about you and about Desmond's work and about LaTosha and Jacqui as well, and Eli, but particularly about your work, is that you are working to ensure that people who are on those margins, those people that Reverend Lewis talked about, who were sort of outside the structures, able to get back into that democratic process and really participate, that their beings are sacred. And as sacred beings, they have a divine right to participate in that process and not allow one mistake or even several mistakes to be encumbrances to their living full and complete and whole lives. And that's what this sort of small d democratic process is about. That's what you're doing to help restore people to that process. That's what you and Desmond do to help restore people's votes. It's just really inspiring and very much appreciated.
And I could just add, I appreciate that, Reverend Davie. I meant to say this, Florida just endured a hurricane. And I'm going somewhere with this. I'm not a preacher, but I'm going somewhere with this. Florida just endured a hurricane. In Southwest Florida, folks lost everything. And today or yesterday was the last day to register to vote. And folks, we're hearing folks worried about how folks are going to vote, how they're going to get stuff built back up, how are folks going to get to a vote booth. And the first thing I said is, you think folks are really worried about voting right now? We got to go meet the man and the woman and the children where they're at right now before you can speak to them about voting. That's not the first thing we need to say. And so it's about removing those other barriers, right? Giving that person somewhere warm to stay, a hot meal, how they could bathe, because this is really what's happening right now in Southwest Florida. Their house is not being flooded. And when you remove those barriers, people have agency, they have clarity to think about, yes, I want to be able to change these conditions that I'm in, and I know that I'm able to do that by making sure that my voice is heard at the voting box. And so what I say that to say, there are so many barriers that face our people, and sometimes that's why voting may not be on the top of their radar, their priority. They know the importance, they feel it, but I gotta get through this other thing. I got 3 jobs I gotta work. I got probation I gotta check into. I have all these other things. And so I appreciate working with organizations that understand that we got to remove these other barriers and continue to preach and teach folks and empower them into the voting box and not shame them. And I think, for a while, I was one of those people shame, you ain't vote. I made one of my cousins, I told them they could eat Thanksgiving dinner at my house because they didn't vote that year. But I've done a lot of work to educate my family. I started with my family first, and Amendment 4 was so important. And so, but I say that I have an uncle who we couldn't understand why he did not engage in voting. Like, we talk about it, we're a voting family, we're family activists. And it wasn't until 2 years ago, and this is an uncle that always helps out. It wasn't until 2 years ago, he just quietly said, I'm not sure I can vote. Now, we are the ones that's fighting for people to have the right to vote. And then also it was the literacy issue. And so we got to meet people where they're at, and we got to just look through those barriers, see the heart, see the intent, and continue to move on. And so I just wanted to leave that with folks, you know, as we meet with people in the field. It may not be that first talk that's going to take that person to the voting booth, but we could plant a seed.
I think that's a great message. Thank you for particularly because we have an audience of people here who many of them are beginning the process of engaging voters and eventually getting voters to the poll, and understanding that there are many barriers to people, many of them personal to them, that keep them from getting to that ballot box is really important. And it all should be a part of the mix as we think about strategies and develop strategies for supporting people to be involved in the democratic process and in voting. So thank you for that, and we'll have more to come. We'll talk a little bit more. I want to turn now to somebody who has been involved in sort of the electoral process from a variety of different points, from being a local pastor who was very involved in the state of Pennsylvania in the 2020 election just recently, and did some important and really effective, impactful work there, to someone who's also been in academia, from teaching at Union Seminary to now teaching at Owen College in Westchester County in New York, and who's been very involved in the Latino community as well, and the faith community, and that's Reverend Eli Valentin. So Eli, we'd like to hear from you first about your background, and then secondly, talk to us about sort of effective and strategic approaches to continuing to get people engaged and involved in voting.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. It's so great to be here. I'm honored by the invitation, and really honored to be joined on this panel by these distinguished women. I'm gonna name them, and I'm gonna share why, but such an honor, Reverend Dr. Lewis, LaTosha, and Sheena. And I say this because we all know what's happened in Los Angeles. And I just have to share this parenthetically. The anti-Blackness that exists within Latino communities, in many ways has been exposed. It's a reality that exists, despite the fact that, like myself, as a Puerto Rican Latino, I have African blood in my family. So I think this panel is, I was gonna say it has symbolic value, but it's more than symbolic. I believe in the possibilities and the necessity of a Black-Brown coalition. Reverend Lewis, said, speak, it'll come into existence. I want to speak the possibilities of all of us coming together to make sure that our communities can thrive in meaningful and just ways. So my distinguished panelists, thank you. And we're in this together. So as Reverend Davie mentioned, I've worn many hats over the, I guess throughout my vocational life, as a pastor within academia, and also in the political world. I've tried to traverse these different paths, avenues, and publics because I see it all interconnected. I think the mission is always to make our lives better. And that's what I have sought to do, even in my own life. Dr. Lewis mentioned, and it is so true that these issues are fundamentally theological at its core. And when I think about voting rights and access to the ballot, I see it as fundamentally a theological issue because it is a matter that encapsulates our understanding and view of what it is to be human. And so I'll put it bluntly, I believe that voter suppression tactics, I believe that certain bills that are being proposed by some legislators in various state legislatures, I believe that they are attacks on the nature of the human being as a creature made in the image of God. And by contrast, supporting expanded voting and ballot access is really to embrace the idea that every human being is deserving of respect and honor because we are all made in the image of God. And it is for this reason that I strongly believe that religious leaders should make voting and ballot access a key component in their own proclamations and their own actions. And again, I strongly believe that what we deem as political matters, like access to the ballot, have nothing to do with how we categorize, or it is believed at least that these things have nothing to do with how we're categorized and viewed as human beings. But I'm of the belief that, on the contrary, politics and these matters in the end, it entails navigating paths or navigating these paths in order to assure that every human being can thrive in meaningful and in equal ways. Now, what does this mean for faith leaders and faith communities specifically? And I believe there are things that we can do and that we can do within our respective constituencies and locations and contexts in order to support access and the expansion of ballot access. For one, I believe that faith leaders must encourage voter registration. Dr. Lewis said, our vote is our voice. And the reality is, if we don't vote, we remain voiceless. We cannot let that happen. Too much has been done to provide particularly communities of color the opportunity to vote. I don't need to highlight the entire history, but we know, for instance, what our African-American brothers and sisters have done, spearheading a movement that produced the Voting Rights Act, right? And part of that coalition were Latinos, like El Mambadillo in New York, that fought to eliminate a language literacy test that really impeded the efforts to get Latinos to register. Never mind to go vote, simply to register. A lot has been done and a lot more needs to take place, but we need to know that it is as simple as getting people to vote. Secondly, I believe that faith leaders should consider civic and voting education programs as part of their overall religious education programming within their local faith communities. Faith leaders should also provide information to their congregants on becoming poll workers, poll watchers. And there are a number of folk, faith-based folk, that are doing a lot of work in this area. Faith leaders should encourage hosting forums and getting the community involved in these forums. And lastly, I would, and I think a good friend of Fred and ours in New York, Jerry Goldfeder, would appreciate this, but I believe that there's a lot that faith leaders and faith communities can do to encourage election law reforms, to ensure that every voter and potential voter can perform their civic duties with no impediments. We can do it. We can do it. And it'll take all of us together, and we'll get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Valentin. So many helpful reminders of the power that we all have to create these sort of programs within our own faith communities, how we can, contact our faith leaders and, share with them the importance of doing these things within our faith communities. Now I want to sort of pivot to our Q&A, which is open to all of you to respond. And just a reminder to our participants that you can enter a question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We've had some questions come in that all sort of ask about how you do this work, how you stand in solidarity with folks who belong to marginalized communities when you yourself may not belong to that community. So for folks who, don't have any proximity necessarily to communities of color, or don't have proximity to folks who are incarcerated or may not have those connections, but deeply care about these issues, what would your advice be to them? How do you stand in solidarity with these communities, and how do you advocate for everyone's inclusion and ability to participate in our democracy?
I just want to kind of address it quickly. One, before I move forward, I do want Reverend Eli, your words were like a healing balm for me today. We have kind of normalized, unfortunately, in this nation, we have normalized anti-Black racism. And in some ways, we create this big bucket of racism, and then there's racism, and then there's this deeper, this anti-Blackness that is always lurking around. That's quite frankly extremely traumatic. Even those of us, just because we've done a good job navigating through it, and by a good job, I mean we're surviving it, does not mean that it is extremely difficult on the human spirit. And I'll just say, I'm sitting in a moment that anti-Blackness is hard. My heart is broken today. And so kind of going back to that space, the other critique I have even in this nation is that we've created this hierarchy based on identity and based on identity politics. And such, I mean, everybody, that everybody has their groups and connect with their family structure and all of that, right? But we've actually assigned value in this country, human value, around what that means. And I raise that because I think that also feeds into this political context that I have to be put in this box, this identity box, and all of who I am is connected to this identity box. And so as we're thinking about how do we work with other communities, I often like to bring this example of, there's a series called The Underground by Misha Green that I love that used to be on, I think, UPN. It was a series. And there's one episode in the series where a character that's playing John Brown is having a conversation with this new abolitionist who was not an abolitionist until her husband was, and then he got killed, and his death kind of triggered her to become an abolitionist. And so in this exchange, she asked him, she was like, what happened for you to become an abolitionist? And then he gives her this elaborate story about when he was a little boy. Long story short, he comes to the end of it, and she's on the end of her seat like, and then he looks at her and he said, none of that happened. I don't have a story. Slavery is just wrong. And then it stops. And I raise that because the story that we have to engage in communities is just a human story. It's just, do we love the humanity of other people to stand in the space? Whether I understand your language or not, I know when a baby is crying, I know what that means, right? When I see a mother that is happy at the airport of welcoming her child, Nobody has to tell me. I don't even have to have the language. I don't even have to see the conversation. I know what is happening because it's at that moment that I'm gone beyond these constraints of what we attach to identity, from language to skin color to family, that literally I'm forced in that moment to literally share and witness a human experience. And so I say that because I also think that we have to take that kind of thinking as we're working in communities. And so we may not be in proximity or have the understanding of certain communities, but I think that if we go into this idea, this effort of literally bringing our whole self and our human self, right? And where there is a space for understanding, there's a space for how can we have service. Sometimes it's just a matter of ask the people who you want to work with, how can you help? It's really that simple. You don't have to know all the answers. It's just as simple. It doesn't have to be, well, I got to have a skill set of working with this group of people. I guarantee you, if you bring your whole authentic self to the space and that your spirit is to be of service, and those that are around you know that your spirit is of service, and you give yourselves and others grace and space, right, to really be able to build this relationship together. Because to me, that's what I think is going to be the real change. The real change is not going to come into, we just got to have to philosophically, we got to agree with each other. I don't agree with myself over a period of time. So this notion that we all have to agree in order for us to find some commonality is just, it is another way that we've created an artificial barrier of how we support each other. And so I'll just close by saying, I think that in this moment, what we are being called is we're being called to move outside of our comfort zone, even myself, right? That I'm constantly being pulled to move outside of my comfort zone. And I say this oftentimes because our politics will not save us. It will be our humanity. And so we can find a space right now to lean into that. And so as we're organizing, we're centering that I see a community in need. And no, I might not know exactly what to do, or I might not know what to say, but I do know how to love. And I do know how to show up and be of service. And I do know how to listen. And I do know how to share. And I think that if we start with those particular kind of attributes in that space, I believe that that's where the transformation happens.
Amen. Everything LaTosha said, and I also would say there is power in proximity. There's power bringing people in a space in proximity. I've seen hearts and minds change, hearts and minds that we thought would not listen to our issues, by just bringing people in proximity who could tell their story authentically and genuinely, not with no shine, no polish. And I've seen on Capitol Hill, I've seen in the governor's office, I've seen with other allies. And so I believe there is power in proximity. And when you're able to create a safe space for folks to do that, to be in proximity, if it's able, that it is some power in that. And I know you can't always get into proximity. We're not trying to take people to course lesson and teach people and tell people all the things and how to move around culture. But I think there's something there. There's a learning, and there's something that is taken back with that person when they're in proximity. I'll just give you an example. I work and lead a bipartisan organization that, we work on all political spectrums. And I'm someone who comes from a very progressive movement. And, a lot of the folks that I got to go meet with, I'm like, oh Lord, they could see me, because these are people I used to do chants and rallies outside the offices. But I was in Wisconsin, and matter of fact, I just saw the young brother. He was at the former incarcerated conference, and it's my first time meeting with him. And I went to their lobby days with them. At that time, I was more in a funder capacity, and I went to one of their lobby days, and we went into this elected official's office, conservative elected official office. And, they give you your few minutes, you could talk, and you could tell that they could just whip us out. And I remember just sitting back, and more of the policy folks were leading, and there was a brother sitting there. I didn't know his full story, but I know he had an ankle monitor on. And before we got out, because he was rushing us out, I just kind of just jutted in, and I said, listen, you got people from your district here that's impacted. And I kind of shouted over to the brother to tell his story. And I said, if you don't mind, can you show your ankle bracelet? And we ended up staying in the office for an hour. The legislator ended up sitting on his desk, wanting to know more, and then realized that he was a part of the problem. He's like, wait a minute, I think I voted on this bill, because he ended up hearing that this young man will have to wear this ankle bracelet for his whole life and pay to have it on his bracelet just for his freedom. And the more he told his story, the man started reflecting on somebody he went to college with, who he was close and who made a mistake. And he was able to identify he didn't want his friend to have to go through something like that. And so it's power in the storytelling's power in bringing people in proximity. And so, you know, I like to say creating spaces. I try to create spaces where people can have that space to have dialogue, to have talk, to share, to learn, and to understand where folks are coming from.
I'd just like to pick up on something that both LaTosha and Sheena said that I think is really important, because we have a number of young people, again, college students and others, who have joined this conversation. And the notion of both being your authentic self and bringing that to these conversations, to these organizing, to the creating voting opportunities for folks is key. You know, people don't want to, it'll be hard to engage with folks if you enter into this thinking that you're coming to do something for somebody. As LaTosha said, let's recognize our common humanity. And as Sheena said, let's share these common stories. Let's be in this space together as fellow human beings. And Jacqui and Eli both pointing us to the grace, the imago Dei, the divinity of the image of God within all of us. And if that's what we bring to this work as interfaith people, or even people of no faith, but people of goodwill, then this democratic process will thrive. We can work together to bring down these barriers to voter participation, voter engagement, and in fact, engagement in fuller life. But if we come with this notion that we are going to do something for somebody, you know, that somehow we're missionaries in the midst of folks who are unenlightened. If we make that mistake again, then our efforts will flounder. But for those young college students out there who are preparing themselves to do this work, connect with that common humanity. It will create a great deal of humility and allow you the space to really engage with folks, to support them in thriving and being the full and complete people and citizens, I think, that God created us all to be. I didn't mean to preach a sermon, but I felt the need to say it. Reverend Lewis.
Yeah, I love what you said, and I want to like join in the chorus of the LaTosha, Sheena, Fred chorus for a second, to pick up on this idea of proximity and connectedness, that politics happens way before we vote, right? Politics is about the polis, about the people. It is about where we live and what we buy and what we consume and what we talk about and what we engage and the media we listen to and the books we read. All those are political choices. And I just was fascinated right there about the proximity issue in the question. And just to kind of do, let's say, midrash on all three of your comments right there, I think as a person of faith, I would say pre-faith is the idea of Ubuntu. Like pre-religion is this ancient Zulu idea that Umuntu, Ubuntu, Ubuntu, a person is a person through other people. I am who I am because you are who you are. Gandhi did that. King said we're inextricably woven in a fabric, a garment of humanity that can't be separated. I can't be fully who I am, who fully you are. So this proximity isn't about where the neighborhood you're in. It's about the empathy you cultivate. And Sheena, you cultivate it with proximity, knowing each other's stories, caring about each other, getting up in it. You cultivate it by seeing the soul of the other. You cultivate it by being humble. You cultivate it by being curious, having a holy curiosity about the other's position. And you cultivate it, to go to Brother Eli's, Hispanic Black thing. I used to live in California and be like, what? How are we not getting along? You are the other person's keeper. We are each other's keeper. And that predates before we vote. It predates faith. But then all the world's religions are like, love your neighbor as yourself, right? They pick it up because we know it's human. We walk out of the cave, out of the darkness, and we're like, somebody got to cook, and somebody's got to catch the rabbit, and somebody's got to raise the kids. Somebody's got to protect the fort. We have to take care of each other. So getting close to each other, hearing each other's stories, seeing we're proximate, even if we live on the other side of the country. That's what I'm trying to say. Because we're human, is core, I think, to the politics of healing our nation.
As we prepare to wrap up, I just want to say that, we're so grateful for this conversation, which is really central to the work we do here at Interfaith America. Everything that we do is to inspire generations of bridge builders who work together to create the world that we want to see. And so I just want to end by just going around to each of you and asking just simply, what gives you hope right now? In the midst of, a 24-hour news cycle that can tell us or make it seem like everything is terrible in the world. Just share briefly one thing that gives you hope.
And let's do it rapid fire with 1 minute because we are close to the top of the hour.
Right. How about we start with LaTosha and go Sheena, Jacqui, and Eli.
What gives me hope is I think that opposition can actually facilitate opportunity. So in this moment of great fierce opposition, I think we have a tremendous amount of opportunity to turn things around.
Sheena.
What gives me hope is going back to the hurricane, seeing these moments that when there's disaster strikes, that folks see each other, humanity, and there's unity. And if people can experience that for a moment and realize how it makes them feel with that act of kindness and how the other person feels, if they could continue to hold on to that. When there is no disaster, when things get messy and political, but that gives me hope that folks actually can act in humanity and see people as human beings.
My phone gives me hope. My church burned down 2 years ago to the ground, and in the fire, so many people, including people in this Zoom squares, reached out to us with love and hope and encouragement. Some 670 people joined our church in the last 2 years just because they found us in the fire. So kind of cribbing on Sheena's disaster brings it out in us. There is a fire burning across the globe, and inside the fire, people are making friends and being each other's helpers and saying, what can I do to save your life? That gives me hope.
Well, I'll have to say that, human beings are a peculiar creature. Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a prominent thinker in the 20th century, said that as individuals, we have, the capacity for so much goodness to do great things. As groups, we have the potential for so much destruction. So it's that dichotomy, that contradiction that exists. But within that contradiction exists potential, and the ability to thrive, and yes, to love each other. So in the end, I have hope in us, in humanity, and that there's enough humanity in us to seek the greater good. And I believe we can.
Thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation and for the fire that you've lit in all of us through your work, through your words, through your dedication to this work. We are very grateful. Just a couple of closing announcements. You can find more virtual opportunities like this on our website at interfaithamerica.org. There you can also explore our Vote is Sacred project page. We are doing this work all over the country and really focusing on campuses and cities around the country that are experiencing, the most significant barriers to voting. We really hope that folks get engaged and learn more about this work. And most importantly, if you take nothing else away from this conversation, please do get ready to vote yourself on November 8th. We have our midterm elections coming up, and it is important for all of us to lift up our voices. If you don't know if you're registered to vote or you don't know how to go about voting, we encourage you to check out usa.gov. You can find a lot of valuable resources there, and you can just take 30 seconds to check your voter registration. There's still time to get registered and to make a voting plan if you don't have one already. And as always, please do keep in touch with us at Interfaith America. We are so grateful to have you all as part of our network. And thank you once again for being here. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.